For decades now, Americans have been told that we should trust the system, but our children are sicker, chronic disease is exploding, and the answers that we've been given aren't working. Many of us have come to the conclusion that government actually lies to us.
Trouble sometimes are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear, now is at stake. Jesus is coming soon, morning or night, our new meaning.
Hi, friends, and welcome back to Season 1, Episode 4, Part 2. And if you did not get a chance to watch the first part of this episode, I will drop a link in the description box. If you haven't watched it, that's okay. This one can actually stand alone pretty well. In Part 2, we're going to see what the Scottish Presbyterians, so the inheritors of John Knox's theological legacy, were up to in the years before and after the American Revolution. We will talk about the influence of Scottish common sense realism, the influence of populism on early American Christianity, and the link between alternative religion and alternative medicine. Scottish Presbyterians really don't get as much credit as they should for American democracy. Sure, the English Puritans were here first, but a lot of what we think of as quintessentially American values were actually just imported Scottish ideals, and specifically Scottish Presbyterian ideals. Presbyterians were so prominent and vocal in the American Revolution that some British troops started calling it the Presbyterian Rebellion. And there was a saying in England that Cousin America has run away with a Presbyterian parson. The Presbyterian parson that Cousin America was supposed to have run away with was a recently transplanted Scottish minister named John Witherspoon. Now, John Witherspoon is somebody you've probably never heard of, but he actually has a lot of claims to fame. He was allegedly a direct descendant of John Knox and, also allegedly, an ancestor of Reese Witherspoon, which I guess means that Reese Witherspoon is a descendant of John Knox. He was a member of the Continental Congress, and he was the only ordained minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. In 1768, Witherspoon had taken a job as the president of the College of New Jersey, which you and I would know under its current name, Princeton University. The College of New Jersey was started by Scottish Presbyterians to train Presbyterian ministers. Under Witherspoon's leadership, it also became a major hub of revolutionary thought, to the point that critics were calling it the school for sedition. There's a saying that John Witherspoon brought the Scottish Enlightenment to America in a carpet bag, which is true, but Witherspoon didn't introduce the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment uncritically. In fact, back in Scotland, Witherspoon had made a name for himself with a satirical book called Ecclesiastical Characteristics, which poked fun at the perceived theological compromises of enlightened Scottish ministers. Still, Witherspoon was a strong believer in reading writers he disagreed with, and he expected his students to do the same. When he came to America, he did bring the Scottish Enlightenment in a very literal sense because he brought books. Witherspoon found the library at the College of New Jersey to be woefully understocked, and he donated his personal library for the school's use. Among the ideas that John Witherspoon brought with him from Scotland was something called common sense realism, which was developed by a Scottish moral philosopher named Thomas Reid in a 1764 book called An Inquiry into the Human Mind. Common sense realism teaches that we can trust our perceptions of the physical world. That might seem really obvious to us in 2026, but in 1764, this was actually not a given.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Reid came up with common sense realism as a challenge to something called the theory of ideas, which was being taught by, among other people, his fellow Scotsman David Hume. So remember back in 1999 when The Matrix came out and we all went to see it and we were walking around wondering if we were living in a simulation. Same vibes here with the theory of ideas. In the Matrix, people are not experiencing the world as it really is. They are simply experiencing sensory input that their brain interprets and constructs into a mental world. The theory of ideas says that we don't really experience objects directly. We are interacting with an idea of the object based on the sensory input that we're getting about it. And that idea may or may not correspond with the reality of that thing, or even other people's perception of that thing. So maybe my idea of a spoon, based on my sensory perception, is different than your idea of the spoon based on your sensory perception, and maybe both of our ideas are different than the reality of the spoon.
There is no spoon.
This wasn't a new idea in the 1990s, and it wasn't even a new idea in the 1760s. Plato's allegory of the cave has basically the same premise, so this goes back to ancient times. But the difference in the 1760s was the scientific revolution had happened. Isaac Newton's inductive method had opened up a whole new world of possibilities about what could be known about the universe. But all of that scientific progress could be stalled if people believed that the knowledge acquired through scientific inquiry was just all an elaborate illusion. This is where common sense realism comes in. Thomas Reid said, "The problem with the theory of ideas is that by its very nature, there's no way to prove or disprove it. But no matter how skeptical we say that we are about our sense perceptions, we all function as if we were having the same sensory experience or a common sense experience. Because we kind of have to." And this is the same dilemma that we all faced when we went to see The Matrix and talked about what if our whole world is fake? What if it's all an illusion? And that's an intriguing what if, but in the end of the day, we were all going to go home, make dinner, do our homework, and set our alarms to get up for school or work the next day. In other words, we're going to function as if our perception of the world is real. Reid said that probably means something. Even though there's no way to prove that our sensory experience is real to somebody who is skeptical about that, the alternative is a practical and an intellectual dead end.
And I've since learned that when you really look at the evidence, the truth is it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to believe in God. You've really got to ignore the facts.
It's funny how we equate the word atheism with intellectual, when it's the exact opposite.
By the time that we get to the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, there was a popular perception that science and religion were in an inevitably antagonistic relationship. But in 1764, that had not really happened yet. Thomas Reid did not foresee that people would take his common sense theory a step further and say, if I can't experience it with my senses, then it's not real. At that point, he was much more worried about David Hume's ultra-skepticism, which he saw as threatening the foundations of religion, morality, and civilization itself. David Hume had taken his skepticism to the point of agnosticism. Thomas Reid, on the other hand, was a lifelong, devout Presbyterian who had actually spent the first 20 years of his career as a minister. His Christian faith was, in fact, a major part of his argument for common sense realism. Reid said that believing our senses is an act of trust in God's goodness and truthfulness. Because of who he is, God would not give us senses that misled us about the nature of reality. So we could consider common sense realism as, among other things, a work of Christian apologetics.
I have never advanced a new idea, and have never aimed to improve on the doctrines of our fathers. Having become satisfied that the system of doctrines taught in the symbols of the Reformed churches is taught in the Bible, I have endeavored to sustain it, and am willing to believe even where I cannot understand. Charles Hodge, 1857.
In the early 1800s, the College of New Jersey was trying to offer students a more generalized education, and that meant that theology stopped being the main course. It was relegated to just one subject among others. It was a specialty that you could go into, but the theology department was not running the show anymore. That feels pretty normal to us, but for many hundreds of years, theology had been considered the reigning queen over all of the other academic disciplines. The College of New Jersey was, like most universities at the time, trying to keep up with the Joneses. And the Joneses, in this case, would be the University of Berlin, which was founded in 1810. It was the first university in Europe not to adopt a theological confession. There was still a theology department, but it was made clear that the doctors of theology weren't going to be able to interfere in the other branches of knowledge. As you may remember from episode 2, the theology department at the University of Berlin was where our old friend Friedrich Schleiermacher, aka the father of theological liberalism, spent most of his career. So, low-key, the Presbyterians did not trust the College of New Jersey to train their future ministers anymore. In 1812, with the blessing of the college, they founded the Princeton Theological Seminary right next door. It was established specifically to protect Christian doctrine from the encroaching secularism that was coming out of the European universities. And its faculty was self-consciously old-fashioned. In 1872, the seminary's president, Charles Hodge, boasted that a new idea never originated with this seminary. And in his mind, that was a flex. Hodge believed that the Reformed tradition had basically figured everything out. They had worked out all the bugs. It was not his job or Princeton Theological Seminary's job to innovate or modernize the faith. They were just supposed to focus on preserving and protecting the Reformed heritage that had been handed down to them. But one modern thinker that they did like was Thomas Reid. Both Charles Hodge and Archibald Alexander, the seminary's first president, were admirers of Thomas Reid, and it's easy to see Reid's common sense realism in Hodge's work. That's really significant because Charles Hodge was one of the most influential theologians of the 19th century, and he was also directly responsible for the spiritual and intellectual formation of first-wave fundamentalists like B.B. Warfield, J. Gresham Machen, and his own son, A.A. Hodge. As we've seen, Charles Hodge didn't think of himself as a modernist or an innovator, but he is one of the thinkers responsible for what I like to call the scientification of Christian theology. Charles Hodge self-consciously saw theology as a science, and he based his method for theological study on the inductive method adopted by Isaac Newton. The inductive method begins with having an open mind. You're not supposed to come to the practice of science with prior commitments or trying to prove some proposition that you already have in mind. You're supposed to start with observation and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Hodge said we need to do the same thing when we practice theology. For Hodge, the only difference between the natural scientist and the theological scientist was where they got their data from. Hodge said,
"The Bible is to the theologian what nature is to the man of science. The duty of the Christian theologian is to ascertain, collect, and combine all the facts which God has revealed concerning himself and our relation to him."
If you've spent some time around the church, the inductive Bible study method might sound familiar to you. This is a 3-step process which involves observation, interpretation, and application. Charles Hodge did not market an inductive Bible study method as such. That would happen later with a guy named Wilbert Webster White, but the basic premise is all here in the first chapter of his systematic theology. The scientification of theology led naturally to the doctrine of inerrancy. It was not until much later, 1978 to be exact, that the formal doctrine of inerrancy as we know it today was codified, but Princeton theologians were already talking about this in the 19th century, using the language of an error-free Bible. If the Bible was going to serve as the foundation for the science of theology, then the theologian had to take the Bible's accuracy for granted in the same way that the scientist takes it for granted that physical evidence can be trusted. At this point, let's take a second in our road trip through Christian fundamentalism to look out the window and see where we are on the timeline. One of the things you'll see is the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. This was 8 years after Charles Hodge had become president of the seminary and 13 years before he published his systematic theology. Now, just from looking at the timeline, it would be totally understandable to think that the doctrine of inerrancy must have been developed in response to Darwin's theory of natural selection. But it would not be until much later that being a Christian, or even being a Christian fundamentalist, would automatically mean a wholesale rejection of Darwin, natural selection, or evolution. Even many of the authors of the fundamentals accepted something called theistic evolution, which says that God worked through the laws of nature, including evolution, to create the world. George Friedrich Wright, who wrote 3 essays in the fundamentals, called himself a Christian Darwinist for a lot of his life, and he spent much of his career as a kind of ambassador of evolution to the church. He even believed that there were striking similarities between Darwinism and Calvinism. Now, by the time that he made his contributions to the fundamentals, his enthusiasm for Darwinism had cooled off a little bit, but he still held to theistic evolution. Charles Hodge did write against Darwin, but his real nemesis was Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of theological liberalism, who we met in episode 2. Hodge had spent some time in Germany in the 1820s and had actually met Schleiermacher in person. There was a mutual respect between the two men, but Hodge was concerned about the way that Schleiermacher based his definition of religion around a subjective feeling of dependence on God. I said in my last video that when Christian fundamentalists push back against one modern theory of knowledge, as often as not, they are just relying on a different modern theory of knowledge without realizing it. This is an example of that, although in Hodge's case, he would have been aware of what he was doing. We've already talked about Schleiermacher in our discussion of Romanticism in episode 2. The Romantics were searching for truth in emotional experience rather than empirical evidence. They felt that in order to really understand what life is all about, you have to transcend the merely physical plane of existence. Theological liberalism, in the tradition of Schleiermacher, would embrace this feelings-oriented theory of knowledge in order to avoid subjecting Christianity to the empirical demands of science. Hodge was not anti-emotion, but he objected to the idea that emotion could serve as the foundation of Christianity. The foundation of Christianity, Hodge said, was a system of doctrine that can only be discovered by studying the Bible. This is actually more empirical than it might sound to modern ears. Schleiermacher's more romantic Christianity was very internal and subjective and hard to pin down. Hodge said that discovering religious truth requires us to get out of our own heads and to explore the objective facts of Scripture. There's a lot to be said for approaching theology as a science. Having a Bible study method is useful for the same reasons that having a scientific method is useful. It slows us down. It keeps us from jumping to wild conclusions based on one verse or one part of a verse. However, beyond the halls of American seminaries, common sense theory and the scientification of theology could get a little weird.
As I went down in the river to pray, studying about the...
As we saw in episode 3, during the Reformation, Protestants united around this doctrine of sola scriptura, scripture alone. During the 19th century, the doctrine of sola scriptura was joined by its weird radical cousin, nuda scriptura, and nuda scriptura is exactly what it sounds like. It is bare scripture. So what's the difference? Sola scriptura puts scripture above human authority and church tradition. Nuda scriptura, on the other hand, just eliminates any element of human authority or church tradition. In the 1830s, the French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville spent 9 months in America, and he was struck with how religious Americans were. It seemed like everyone had these passionate, deeply felt convictions about religion. Democracy didn't cause Christianity to go extinct in America, but it did radically change the character of Christianity because it put the people, instead of a religious hierarchy, in the driver's seat. We've seen that this was already starting to happen with John Knox and the Scottish Reformation, but American Christianity took things to a whole new level. The 19th century became the era of DIY religion, and really DIY everything.
Nailed it.
Keep in mind, we are 300 years down the road from the Protestant Reformation at this point. The Presbyterian establishment had become to many early 19th century Americans what the Pope was to the early Protestants. People were getting really impatient with the Calvinist doctrines of total depravity and predestination. They didn't want to stop being Christians, but they were tired of being told that they didn't really have free will, or that they couldn't trust their own reason, or even their own sense of right and wrong. They were tired of these dusty confessional documents that told them exactly how to interpret Scripture, and they were tired of being dictated to by the clergy class. Anti-clericalism wasn't new. It was actually one of the leading social causes of the Protestant Reformation. In the religious wars of the 1600s, Protestants had coined this term priestcraft. The word association that you're probably hearing between priestcraft and witchcraft was not accidental. It created this impression that the mysterious rites and rituals of the Catholic Mass were just so much hocus pocus. Protestants believed that the Catholic clergy were deliberately making Christianity more complicated and mysterious than it actually was, so that lay Christians would believe that they just had to rely on the clergy's judgment. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Christians outside of the Protestant establishment started throwing that term priestcraft around again. Only now, they were applying it to really anybody who made a claim to spiritual authority or even theological expertise. On the one hand, we could say this was just the Protestant chickens coming home to roost. On the other hand, we can't ignore the political context.
For your homes, for king, for country, that's why you men ought to join this fight.
You do what you want with your own skull, and I'll be telling us what we ought to do with ours.
You call yourself a patriot and loyal subject to the crown?
Do not call myself subject to much at all.
The spirit of 1776 really came hard for religion after the Revolutionary War was over. And when I say the spirit of 1776, I'm not talking about guys in tights and wigs signing the Declaration of Independence. I am talking about regular people. So think less George Washington and more Daniel Day-Lewis in The Last of the Mohicans. It's important that we not generalize about the guiding principles of the American Revolution. The political philosophies of the Founding Fathers were complex and nuanced. However, a lot of that nuance tended to rub off by the time that those ideas filtered down to the masses. What was left for many people was populism. Whatever the majority of people want must be right.
Popular.
And the flip side of populism was anti-elitism. And pretty much anyone with any kind of institutional or cultural authority was fair game. Common sense theory, or really the popular version of common sense theory, seems to imply that anybody could be an expert on anything because everybody has common sense. Combined with the concept of priestcraft, it created the sense that if something couldn't be grasped quickly and easily by a regular person, somebody was probably trying to trick you. The clergy weren't the only ones to be affected by the more radical side of common sense theory. There was a huge explosion of printed media in the years before and after the Revolution. This, combined with the fact that America's literacy rate was exceptionally high, made early America a very information-saturated country. Now, this sounds like a good thing, but there's a dark side.
What has Google done for me lately?
What has Google done for me lately?
They wanted to do an emergency blood transfusion. Just on a hunch, I went to Google on my cell phone.
And it came up with this article that said not to do the blood transfusion.
We showed the neonatologist who went back and did some research, and ultimately he came back and he said that everything was fine. So I'm a big fan of the Google search engine.
And you're going to stand on the stage and say that vaccines and autism are unrelated?
Information about things that are happening with the CDC, the pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of things that are not said.
It's a smokescreen. Anybody who takes the time to read it would agree.
I, as a parent of a child who has autism, I'm concerned.
I'm so sick of doctors who don't read the studies, who don't know the details, sitting here telling parents and reassuring them that vaccines don't cause autism.
Newspapers in the American colonies were a lot like the birth of the internet. There was exponentially more information available, but there was nobody gatekeeping all this media. Journalistic standards had not been invented yet. Newspaper editors had families to feed, and will it sell was often a more important question than is it true? But in the same way that a 10-minute Google search makes some people feel like they're an expert on something that people spend years learning, Newspapers made their readers feel well informed and confident in their ability to look at the facts and form their own opinions, or, in the expression of today, to do their own research. And sometimes alternative medicine and alternative religion joined forces. Elias Smith was an independent preacher who helped to found the Christian Connection, a denomination that refused to adopt any creeds but the Bible itself. In 1808, he founded a paper called the Herald of Gospel Liberty, which he claimed was the world's first religious newspaper. Smith also had an interest in herbal medicine, which led him into a partnership with Samuel Thompson, a self-taught medical practitioner who relied on natural herbal remedies. Now, reality check. There were no medical licensing boards, and doctors did often leave people worse off than when they found them. However, Samuel Thompson wasn't just introducing a new kind of medicine. He was introducing a very radical approach to wellness. Thompson said that people just don't really need doctors. They could learn to treat themselves at home with natural homemade remedies. And Elias Smith used his position as a spiritual leader to promote Thompson's health and wellness philosophy. Samuel Thompson and Elias Smith seem like kind of an odd couple, but when you consider the influence of populism and common sense theory on early American culture, their partnership starts to make sense. Elias Smith wanted to liberate people from the tyranny of the religious expert, and Samuel Thompson wanted to liberate people from the tyranny of the medical expert. And these kinds of pairings are all around us today. If you think about companies like Herbalife or doTERRA or Young Living, all of these companies have Mormon or evangelical undertones.
A real honor for me to introduce Robert F. Kennedy Jr., take the oath of office and officially become our Secretary of Health and Human Services.
This isn't going to be about politics. It's about our families, it's about our children, and it's about confronting the spiritual malaise and embracing the truth. If we want a healthy nation, we have to confront the lies that have made us spiritually, morally, and physically sick. The time for half measures is now over.
In 2024, evangelicals helped to put Donald Trump in the White House for a second time. Trump promised in his inauguration speech that he was ushering in a golden age. So what has that golden age looked like in terms of American health? The appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the Secretary of Health has made a lot of medical conspiracy theories seem much more respectable. Measles is a disease that we had pretty much gotten rid of by the year 2000, but it has come back with a vengeance under RFK Jr.'s watch.
All I want is your honest opinion.
I don't know if this is comforting or not, but I think after today's episode, we can say that American Christians came by our weakness for charismatic leaders and conspiracy theories honestly. A long time ago, we fell for the idea that democracy means that we don't need experts. We can know it all by ourselves. We also fell for the idea that democracy means that whatever the people want, they get, even if it goes against existing laws or long-standing norms and customs. That is not a sustainable way of doing democracy, and it's not a very biblical approach to life either. This year, I'm writing a book on Proverbs for the Gnostics Center for Christian Education and Ministry. So I've really been marinating in Proverbs and the rest of the Bible's wisdom literature. And I have to say that I am starting to see the relevance of all of these verses that you see about having an appropriate sense of deference for people who know more than you do, whether it's because of age, whether it's because of a specific kind of life experience that they have, earned expertise, or whatever it may be. Everybody can't know everything, and that's actually a good thing. It promotes humility and interdependence. When I know something that you don't know, but you know something that I don't know too, and we have to trust each other to use that knowledge well. It's also a good thing when people who aspire to be experts in some particular area understand that they need to actually demonstrate that they've done the work. Usually that's going to mean things like academic credentials or licensing or whatever institutional hoops you're expected to jump through in your particular field. That's not pride, that's actually humility. It's saying, I don't expect you to just take my word for it. I'm showing you the respect of proving that I have expertise in this area before I'm asking you to trust me. Now, as much as I have harangued about alternative medicine and all these other anti-establishment rabbit holes, I don't mean to imply that the establishment always gets it right or that people outside of the establishment always get it wrong. If you want to hear about that, ask me about the history of midwifery someday. But this reflexive mistrust for experts, because they are experts, is addictive. Because let's face it, it feels good to dump on the elites. But it's a little bit like eating too much Taco Bell. You're going to regret it eventually. We can't do our own research on everything because we aren't going to be alive long enough to do that. There are limits to our aptitudes for certain things, or our access to education, or just the time that we have in our day and the time that we have in our lives. We have to get that idea out of our heads that just because it cannot be explained in a 5-minute YouTube video, that somebody's trying to trick you. Some things just do require years of building incremental knowledge to understand, and that's okay. Don't turn your brain off, but don't think that you can Google how to fly an airplane and then be able to successfully land a 747. Enough about my opinion. I would like to hear yours. Was the scientification of Christianity a move in the right direction, or was it a mistake? Do you see the parallels between early American Christianity and today's conspiracy-happy religious culture? Do you agree that we should have a healthy respect for institutional authority, or do we need to just burn it all to the ground? Let me know what you think in the comments on any of those questions or anything else that you'd like to say about this episode. See you in the next video. Until then, go in peace and stay groovy.
Troublesome